The fluorescent lights hummed their electric lullaby, and Danielle Ross pushed through the ICU doors at 11:41 p.m., her badge swinging against her ribs like a metronome counting down the hours until dawn. 8 months at Oak Creek Memorial in Portland, and she'd perfected the art of being unremarkable, the nurse nobody remembered, the one who showed up on time, kept her head down during rounds, and asked no questions about the lives breaking on the monitors around her. Her sneakers were silent on the polished tile. They were always silent. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular loneliness of night shift. She hung her jacket on the hook in her locker, the one with the cracked lining that nobody had ever noticed, and pulled out her shift report. The faded unit patch was still there, sewn into the interior with stitches so precise they looked like scar tissue, the fabric so worn it felt like silk now after 3 years of her fingers finding it in dark moments. She didn't look at it. She never looked at it. "Night, Major," the IT guy said. His name was Tyler. 26 years old, Army Reserve, the kind of young veteran who recognized the way she moved through corridors, tracking exits without turning her head, noting which staff members had weak situational awareness, remembering the precise distance between her position and every door. He was the only person at Oak Creek who understood that some people didn't get to stop being tactical just because they'd hung up their uniform. She nodded. That was all she ever gave anyone. The ICU that night held 5 patients in various states of decline. Room for 12 was a septic patient trending toward organ failure, his breathing shallow and desperate. Room for 14 held a post-op cardiac patient whose monitor rhythm made her pause. Something about the P-wave configuration didn't sit right with her, and she made a note to mention it to the night attending, though she knew from 8 months of practice that nobody would listen to just a nurse about anything. Room for 18 was quiet, stable, the kind of room where people got better or didn't, and the difference was often measured in millimeters of medication dosage and hours of sleep missed by their families in the waiting room. She began her rounds at midnight. The antiseptic smell was sharp enough to taste, cutting through the stale coffee and the undernote of human illness that clung to every hospital after dark. She moved between rooms with movements that would have looked graceful to anyone watching, economy of motion, no wasted energy, everything purposeful. Her hands, when she touched a patient, were steady as surgical laser. She repositioned a patient with a pneumothorax risk using leverage and angle rather than strength, movement she'd learned a lifetime ago on a dusty FOB in Tikrit when she was something other than invisible. The supply room door was cracked open at 12:34 a.m. Danielle passed it and noted the angle without stopping, without turning her head. Her eyes tracked the shadow inside, male, approximately 6 feet tall, left-handed based on the reach toward the upper shelf, wearing a white coat with a hospital ID badge, moving with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to check over his shoulder. She was 20 feet past the door when her brain catalogued what her eyes had seen, 3 controlled medication vials being transferred from the locked dispensary into a leather messenger bag. The movements were practiced. Efficient. Not the fumbling of someone stealing for the first time. She didn't stop. She didn't slow. She continued to room for 15 where Mrs. Chen was sleeping, her oxygen saturation running at 96%, her heart rate steady at 68. Danielle adjusted the blanket, checked the fall line, and noted everything in the chart with handwriting so careful and precise it looked like calligraphy. But her jaw clenched. The supply room door swung open fully as she was writing, and Dr. Ashford emerged, chief of surgery, expensive watch catching the fluorescent light, hair perfectly arranged, the kind of man whose tailored coat and manicured hands had probably never touched anything that could break. He didn't see Danielle. People like Dr. Ashford moved through hospitals the way sharks moved through water, aware of the presence of prey but not particularly invested in noticing any individual small fish. He walked past her to the nurse's station. Danielle's shoulders stayed level. Her breathing remained steady. Her hands didn't shake. But her eyes tracked him the way they'd tracked threat angles in Tikrit, noting his position relative to exits, calculating the distance from his location to hers, observing that his messenger bag hung on his left shoulder, which meant his right arm was free, which meant if she needed to move, she had an advantage because she'd be expecting it and he wouldn't. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She finished her charting and moved to room for 16, where the admission was arriving. The stretcher came through the doors at 1:09 a.m., preceded by the sound of wheels squeaking against tile and the precise clipped voices of paramedics giving report. The patient was unconscious, male, approximately 65 years old, wearing what had been a dress uniform before whoever had brought him in had loosened the collar and unbuttoned the top. His dog tags were visible against his chest. Colonel Marcus Rivera, the paramedic said. Admitted unconscious via 911. Found unresponsive at his residence. Medical history unclear, patient nonverbal. Vital stable en route. Last recorded BP 138/82, heart rate 71, O2 sat 99% on room air. Danielle moved into the room as they transferred him to the hospital bed, her hands already connecting leads and arranging the monitoring cables with the automaticity of someone who'd done this motion 10,000 times. The monitor sprang to life, steady sinus rhythm, normal intervals, nothing obviously acute on the EKG. But she'd learned long ago that the things that were killing you were rarely the things that showed up on machines first. She looked at his face. For 3 years, she'd carried a photograph in her wallet, a young Marine in dress uniform, dark eyes, the kind of smile that had made him popular in letters home before the letters stopped coming. His commanding officer had sent her a letter after that, a formal notification that her son had been killed in action during a mounted patrol in Tikrit, and the letter had included commendations and language that was supposed to make it mean something, supposed to transform a body count into a narrative of honor. The commanding officer's face was on that letter. She'd read it 472 times. "Get his chart," she said to the resident, and something in her voice made the young doctor move without asking why. "I need to know what he was admitted for." "Stat!" "Just a nurse ordering around residents," a voice said behind her. Dr. Ashford was in the doorway, his expression somewhere between amusement and contempt. "I think the attending physician can handle the admission, Ms. Ross." She didn't turn around. "Room for 12 needs a blood gas," she said, still focused on the monitor. "Room for 14 has a rhythm irregularity that needs assessment. And Colonel Rivera's chart needs to be on this monitor in 90 seconds or I'm calling a stat page." The pause that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Dr. Ashford turned and walked away. The residents moved like startled birds, suddenly efficient, suddenly aware that something in the room's atmosphere had shifted. The attending physician appeared within minutes, older, competent, the kind of doctor who recognized that a patient with a military background admitted unconscious needed more than routine vitals. The chart showed no obvious trauma, no hemorrhage, no reason for the unconsciousness that should have resolved during transport. "What's your assessment?" the attending asked her, and it was a question that assumed she had one, which told her something about how she moved through the world, even 8 months into her attempt at invisibility. "No obvious acute process," Danielle said, and her voice was steady as still water. "But something brought him down. Something that doesn't show up on his surface." The attending nodded and moved closer to the patient, his hands assessing what instruments couldn't measure. The night deepened around them. The monitors beeped their mechanical rhythm. And Danielle stood at the bedside of a man whose name was on a letter she'd never burned, watching his chest rise and fall, wondering what kind of world would put both of them in the same room in the same hospital at the same moment, and whether that was coincidence or whether it was something she'd been running from for 8 months finally catching up. Behind her, somewhere in the hospital's darkness, Dr. Ashford was in the supply room, and he'd been in there before, and he would be in there again. But that wasn't the problem yet. The problem, breathing steadily under the fluorescent lights with his dog tags catching the cold white glow, was a man named Marcus Rivera, who'd sent her a letter 3 years ago that she kept in a drawer beneath her underwear, unopened on the day her son died. Within 2 days, the schedule board didn't lie. Danielle stared at the new assignments posted in the break room at 6:44 a.m. Her name moved from ICU night shift to pediatric wing, effective immediately. No explanation. No conversation. Just a logistics decision made by someone who'd already decided her value. She asked the charge nurse, Janet, why the reassignment happened so fast. Janet wouldn't meet her eyes. "Operational needs," she muttered, adjusting the blood pressure cuff on her shoulder. The real answer was written in the way Janet's jaw tightened and how she suddenly found the supply cart very interesting. Danielle had seen this before, not in hospitals, but in the barracks at Fort Bragg when the unit turned on someone. The machinery of institutional erasure grinding into motion. The break room door had been cracked that first night. Danielle had passed the supply closet at 2:14 a.m. on her way to retrieve fresh dressing packs. Through the gap in the door, she'd seen Dr. Ashford's hands moving with surgical precision, not performing surgery, but something else. A controlled medication bottle disappeared into his personal leather bag. Then another. His hands were steady, practiced, the movements of someone who'd done this calculation 100 times before. When he looked up and their eyes met, he didn't flinch. He didn't hurry. He simply held her gaze for 1 second, and in that second, she understood he'd seen her see him, and he'd decided it didn't matter. Not yet. On the third day, the public write-up appeared on the unit board. The paper was printed on hospital letterhead, her name centered under the heading in Arial font. Dr. Ashford's signature loomed at the bottom. The charge was improper documentation on patient chart for 47B, dated 2 days prior. Danielle read it twice. She'd never touched chart for 47B. She'd worked the opposite wing that night. The accusation was deliberate fiction, filed with the precision of a surgeon's blade. Other nurses gathered in clusters around the bulletin board, reading it in low voices. One of them, a Maria from the evening shift, whispered something that landed in the break room air like a stone in still water. "Charity case," she said, not quite under her breath. 2 other nurses smiled. Danielle felt the temperature of the room change. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came in the break room at 12:13 p.m. when she sat down with her lunch, a protein bar and black coffee, the same thing she'd eaten for 3 years, and watched the collective exodus. 5 nurses entered the break room, read her presence like a weather pattern, and suddenly needed to eat somewhere else. Gathered their containers. One whispered about attitude problems as they filed out the door. The fluorescent light above Danielle's seat flickered in irregular pulses, casting her in stuttering shadows. She ate her protein bar without tasting it. The room hummed with empty sound, the refrigerator compressor, the ice maker cycling, the distant beep of monitors from the units beyond the walls. Isolation had a frequency. She was learning it. The evening rounds changed everything. Dr. Ashford found her on the pediatric wing, where she was checking a 4-year-old's foresight. He stood in the doorway of the patient's room, where an elderly woman and her daughter sat beside the small hospital bed, the granddaughter sleeping against the mother's shoulder. "Nurse Ross," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. "A word." He gestured for her to step into the hallway, but instead he turned and spoke directly in front of the family, his posture angled so they could witness every word. "I've received several complaints about your tendency to question medication orders. Yesterday you challenged my dosing on a pediatric case. Your job is to follow orders, not play doctor. If you can't handle the pressure of this profession, perhaps you should reconsider whether you're cut out for it." His eyes moved across the daughter's face, watching her clutch her mother's hand a little tighter. The granddaughter woke. The elderly patient's monitors began beeping faster, stress, fear, the vital signs of watching a public crucifixion. Danielle felt something move through her body. Not anger. Not humiliation. Something deeper and quieter. She took one measured breath. Held it for 2 seconds. Released it through her nose. A single tear escaped her left eye without warning, and she wiped it away without breaking contact with his gaze. When she spoke, her voice came out like still water, the kind that has nothing underneath it but depth. "I will always choose my patient's safety over your ego, doctor." The room went absolutely silent. The elderly woman's heart monitor stopped the irregular acceleration and returned to sinus rhythm, as if the patient herself had heard something that calmed her back to baseline. Dr. Ashford's face darkened to the color of old brick. He walked out without another word. Danielle finished checking the child's dressing, her hand steady as surgical steel, but when she returned to the pediatric station, she could feel the tremor underneath, not fear. Restraint. The kind that comes from having survived things that would have killed most people. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her apartment listening to rain hammer the windows, listening to it like mortar fire, like the sound of rotor wash that never quite landed. At 6:15 a.m., her work phone buzzed. HR wanted to see her. The message was formal but brief. She showered, wore her scrubs. The walk to the administrative offices felt like movement through water. The HR director, a woman named Patricia who'd been hired 6 months ago and had probably never seen actual medical trauma, sat across from a wooden desk with Dr. Ashford's file open. "We've received a formal complaint," Patricia began, reading from a sheet of paper with the cadence of someone performing a script. "Creating a hostile work environment. Insubordination. Undermining physician authority." The words were rehearsed, loaded, and Danielle understood immediately what was happening. This wasn't investigation. This was execution wearing the mask of procedure. "We're recommending a 2-week unpaid suspension pending investigation," Patricia said, her fingers tented in front of her. It wasn't a recommendation. It was a prelude to termination. Danielle nodded. She'd seen this choreography before, not in hospitals, but in investigations, in courts-martial proceedings, in the careful administrative machinery that removed people who'd become inconvenient. She asked for nothing. Challenged nothing. Said only, "When do I turn in my badge?" By 4 p.m., security had escorted her to the locker room. Her hospital badge no longer opened the ICU doors. The system was already reconfiguring her access, erasing her from the rooms where she mattered. The guard, a young man named Derek who'd always nodded respectfully when she passed, wouldn't meet her eyes as she placed the badge on his desk. She gathered the items from her locker. A spare pair of scrubs. A photo of her son in his marine dress uniform. The cracked ceramic mug he'd sent her from Camp Lejeune. The faded unit patch from her special operations platoon, still sewn into the lining of her jacket, still hidden from every eye that passed her in the corridors. At 11:04 p.m., while she was microwaving instant ramen in her apartment, her personal phone rang. The charge nurse, Janet. Voice shaking. "Danielle, I shouldn't call but Colonel Rivera. He's crashing. Lung collapse. Sucking chest wound, we don't know how it happened, and the on-call surgeon is stuck in traffic, maybe 15 minutes out. We're bagging him but his oxygen saturation is dropping. 71 and falling. I thought you should know." The call ended. Danielle stood in her kitchen, the ramen steam rising against her face, and understood in that single moment what had been set in motion. She moved without thinking. Grabbed her keys. The drive from her apartment to Oak Creek Memorial took 12 minutes and 37 seconds. She hit 56 miles per hour through a residential zone at 11:21 p.m. The rain hammered the windshield like applause. Like an answer to a question she'd stopped asking 3 years ago. The ER entrance doors slid open and Danielle moved through them like water, her suspended badge useless but the chaos overriding every protocol. 23 minutes since the phone call. Her hands were steady on the steering wheel the whole drive, no tremor, no hesitation, just a Marine's muscle memory converting fear into forward motion. The parking garage smelled like wet concrete and diesel exhaust. Now the ICU corridor smelled like antiseptic and something else, something wrong. She'd been off shift for 14 hours. Off hospital grounds entirely. Off the payroll as of 3 p.m., when HR handed her the termination letter signed by Dr. Ashford's ally, Hospital Counsel Barrett Hayes, on letterhead that still felt warm from the printer. Off the unit. Off the charts. Officially non-existent in Oak Creek Memorial's system. But Colonel Marcus Rivera didn't know that. The monitors didn't know that. And muscle memory operated outside institutional databases. The young resident on duty couldn't have been more than 2 years out of med school, maybe 26, with trembling hands and the specific panic of someone watching their career implode in real time, didn't even question her presence. Danielle moved past him like she owned the room, which, in a way, she still did. The confidence of someone who'd held a tourniquet on a bleeder while mortars fell on the compound. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Colonel Rivera's monitor was screaming. Oxygen saturation, 68 and falling. Respiratory rate shallow. The left side of his chest, the same side where shrapnel should have missed him but didn't, was making a sound Danielle recognized from Tikrit. The wet, sucking sound of a chest wound that wasn't supposed to exist. A chest wound that someone had created while he was stable. While he was sleeping. While nobody was watching closely enough. She was at his bedside in 3 steps. How long? Her voice wasn't a question. It was a command, pitched low, the kind that made people move without thinking. 15 minutes, maybe. His O2 dropped so fast. I called respiratory, but... She wasn't listening to the rest. She was looking at Rivera's intercostal spaces, at the absence of breath sounds on the left, at the way his sternum was retracting with each shallow breath like his own chest was trying to collapse inward. Someone had created this. Someone had opened a careful wound in a man who was supposed to recover, supposed to stabilize, supposed to go home. Someone had wanted him dead badly enough to risk it during hospital hours. That someone was Dr. Ashford. The realization moved through her without breaking her stride. She pulled her jacket off the back of the nearby chair, the same jacket that held her suspended ID, her cell phone, and the thing she'd never removed in 8 months of pretending to be just a nurse. The faded Special Forces unit patch, sewn into the lining with thread so old it was nearly invisible. The thing that had gotten her through the nights. The reminder that Major Danielle Ross still existed somewhere, underneath the scrubs and the false documentation and the carefully constructed anonymity. She tore the lining open. The seam ripped clean. She'd loosened it deliberately 3 years ago, right before she ran, right before she buried herself in this hospital where nobody asked questions about scars or vacant eyes. The patch fell into her palm. Worn fabric that had traveled through Tikrit, through a Black Hawk, through 3 years of silence. Behind it, the small wax backing from an MRE package she carried in her pocket out of habit. Peanut butter meal, from last week. The wax would seal. It would work. It had worked before. Get me a 14-gauge needle. Now. Not a request. Not please. A command that made the resident jump like he'd been shocked. She didn't wait for the needle. She positioned herself over Rivera's chest, located the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line, muscle memory finding the landmarks as if her hands were reading a map written into her own skeleton. The needle was there. She took it without looking. Prep for needle decompression. You have 10 seconds. Her voice had dropped an octave. It sounded like a radio that hadn't been turned on in 3 years suddenly crackling back to life. Her hands were moving in cadences she hadn't used since Tikrit, since the last time someone she knew had a chest wound and she was the only one close enough to matter. The needle went in smooth and clean. The hiss of air escaping, high-pressure air that had been suffocating Rivera's lung, compressed in the space between lung and chest wall. The sound was almost musical if you'd heard it before in the exact same context. Danielle had heard it before. Multiple times. Rivera's oxygen saturation began to climb. 70, 75. 82, she was already positioning the improvised chest seal, the MRE backing providing just enough adhesive backing to seal the wound partially, not perfectly, but enough to keep the air flowing in the right direction. In medical school, this was theoretical. In Tikrit, this was survival. The distinction mattered less than the result. Get me a pressure dressing. Non-adherent sterile gauze. Tape. The resident was moving. The nurse was moving. The monitors were beeping in steadier rhythms. Rivera's vitals were stabilizing. His oxygen saturation was climbing through 88, toward 90, toward something that didn't look like active dying. The color was returning to his face. The panic was leaving the resident's expression and being replaced by something that looked like understanding. This wasn't just a suspended nurse. This was someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Danielle taped the dressing with the kind of precision that had nothing to do with nursing school and everything to do with field medicine. The kind of speed that came from having done this in the dark, in dust storms, while people screamed and vehicles burned. Her hands moved like they were on rails, smooth and inevitable. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst and knowing that panic was luxury. The room went almost silent. Just the ventilator, the monitors, the soft whisper of tape sealing the wound. The machinery of a body being kept alive, stabilized, pulled back from the edge by someone who understood edges the way most people understood breakfast. That was when the door opened. Dr. Ashford stood in the entrance for exactly 2 seconds before his face changed. Danielle didn't have to look at him to know the expression shifting across his features. She could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure. The way a predator feels another predator in the room. She finished taping the dressing. Stepped back. Met his eyes with the flat, neutral gaze of someone who had survived things that would break most people into pieces. She just... The resident's voice was shaking. She just knew what to do. She saved him. She was suspended, but when she heard the code... Dr. Ashford's jaw clenched. His hands flexed at his sides. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the moment when he realized that she hadn't just seen him stealing medications. She hadn't just been inconvenient. She was something far more dangerous to him. She was competent in ways that had nothing to do with Oak Creek Memorial. She was operating in a register he couldn't touch, couldn't compete with, couldn't control. "Security," he said quietly. "Call security now." His face wasn't angry. It was something worse than anger. It was the expression of someone watching an entire edifice of power crumble in real time. The medication theft was manageable. A terminated nurse he'd discredited was manageable. But a nurse who moved like a soldier. Who barked commands that made medical residents jump. Who just saved a patient he'd tried to kill using nothing but a jacket patch and her own hands. That was something else entirely. She should have seen it coming. The phone call to his allies. The emails being drafted. The narrative being constructed even as she watched it happen. Dr. Ashford had spent 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial building relationships, accumulating favors, positioning people in key positions. He would use all of that now. He would burn through every resource he had to make sure that what happened in this room didn't become a story that got told outside these walls. But Danielle wasn't thinking about that yet. Colonel Rivera's oxygen saturation was 92 now and climbing. His heart rate was dropping back into a normal range. His color was improving. The wound was sealed. The bleeding was controlled. The crisis was contained. She wiped her hands on the medical waste bin and turned to face Dr. Ashford with an expression that had been filed down by 3 years of pretending to be smaller than she was. "He'll need monitoring every 15 minutes, she said. Her voice was still dropped low. Still carrying the weight of someone who understood consequence. Watch for signs of increased pressure. If his O2 dips below 88, needle decompression again. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line." She wasn't asking permission to give instructions. She was giving them. The distinction would matter later when depositions were being taken and people were trying to understand how a suspended nurse had ended up being the authority in the room while the chief of surgery watched it happen. Dr. Ashford's hands were actually trembling now. She could see it. The small, involuntary shake of someone who understood that he'd lost control of the narrative. That whatever story he'd been telling about her dismissal, whatever isolation he'd orchestrated, whatever documentation he'd falsified, all of it had just been overwritten by a single code. By a single moment where Major Danielle Ross had stopped pretending to be anyone else. Security arrived 7 minutes later. 2 officers in dark uniforms, looking confused about their instructions. Danielle was already walking toward them, her jacket draped over her arm, the torn lining a small tear in the fabric that nobody would notice unless they were specifically looking for it. She didn't resist. She didn't argue. She simply allowed herself to be escorted out of the ICU, past the nurse's station, past the young resident who was already writing his incident report and not mentioning Dr. Ashford's presence at all. Past the monitors. Past the place where she'd been carefully erased. The walk to HR took 12 minutes. The termination took 4. The phone call Dr. Ashford was making to his allies on the hospital board happened while she was still in the office, while Counsel Barrett Hayes was explaining to her that her employment was being terminated effective immediately, that there would be no severance due to violation of suspension terms and unauthorized patient contact, that she should not return to the facility, that her nursing license would be flagged for review, that attempting to contact hospital staff regarding the incident would constitute harassment. The words were meant to break her. The structures behind them were meant to isolate her. The whole system that Dr. Ashford had constructed was meant to make her impossible to believe if she tried to tell anyone what happened. But she wasn't trying to tell anyone anything. She was just listening. Just absorbing. Just understanding the exact dimensions of the wall that had been built in front of her. Within the hour, HR called her into the office on the 3rd floor. The room smelled like burnt coffee and laminated policies. Danielle sat across from a woman named Patricia whose hands were trembling slightly as she opened a manila folder. Not because she believed what was inside. Because she knew exactly who had filled it. Creating a hostile work environment, Patricia read, her voice thin. Insubordination. Refusing direct orders from attending physician Dr. Ashford. Danielle didn't blink. Patricia slid a printed email across the desk. Danielle's eyes caught the timestamp, 11:43 p.m., dated tonight. The email was from Dr. Ashford himself, copied to the Chief of Surgery, the VP of Clinical Operations, and 3 board members whose names Danielle recognized from the hospital letterhead in the lobby. The message was efficient, precise, and absolutely false. It described a scene that hadn't happened, quote she'd never said, violation she'd never committed. It was written like a legal brief. Like someone had already prepared this document weeks ago and was simply filling in the date. Your termination is effective immediately, Patricia said. You'll need to turn in your badge. Security will escort you out. Danielle stood up. Her hands remained steady. Her voice remained level. I'd like to speak with the hospital administrator. That won't be possible. Dr. Ashford has already briefed the board. The decision is final. There it was. Not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. A coordinated execution. Danielle understood, in that moment, the exact shape of her opponent's institutional power, and why he'd been so confident in his movements. He'd already won the moment he decided to. He had allies. He had the board. He had the kind of power that moves through phone calls at midnight, through carefully worded emails, through personnel files that disappear and reappear with different dates. She stood without another word. Patricia's discomfort deepened. Danielle knew she should have protested, should have cried, should have fought back. Instead, she simply left the room, walked down the corridor with her badge hanging from her neck, and descended the stairs to the main lobby where 2 security officers were waiting. The guards didn't touch her. They didn't need to. They simply walked on either side as she moved toward the sliding glass doors. One of them, a younger man, looked like he wanted to say something but didn't. They all knew. The entire hospital probably knew by now. Or would, by morning. Danielle pushed through the doors into the Portland rain. It was the kind of rain that felt personal, not falling from the sky so much as rising from the pavement to meet you halfway. It soaked through fabric instantly, turned the world into a smeared watercolor painting, made everything look like it was dissolving. She walked across the parking lot with her cardboard box balanced on her hip. Security watched from the lobby until she was out of sight, then they turned back inside. She didn't go home. She walked 3 blocks to the bus stop across from Oak Creek Memorial, where she could see the lit windows of the hospital rising against the dark Portland sky. The fluorescent glow made the rain look like it was falling through liquid light. She stood under the shelter, dripping onto the concrete, and looked down at the box in her arms. The cracked mug was on top, white ceramic with a Marine Corps emblem barely visible through 3 years of use. Her son had sent it to her at her last duty station, back when she still answered to her rank, back when the world knew her name. Beneath the mug was the succulent, its leaves turned pale and papery from weeks of neglect. She'd been meaning to water it since she arrived in Portland 8 months ago, but the timing never felt right. Now it probably wouldn't matter. She'd never know if it could have been saved. At the bottom of the box was the photograph. Lance Corporal James Hernandez. 22 years old. Killed during a convoy ambush outside Ramadi in 2008. She'd sponsored him through the mentorship program when he was 19, had written him letters his entire deployment, had attended his funeral in San Antonio where his mother had thanked Danielle without knowing that Danielle had been the last person to speak to him, a 2-minute radio conversation where he'd told her he was proud to serve and asked her to tell his mother he loved her. She delivered that message herself, at the funeral, and then she'd gone back to work. Danielle stood at the bus stop and watched her reflection dissolve in the puddles forming on the concrete. The rain turned her face into something unrecognizable, broken, scattered, reassembling and dissolving in rhythm with the water's ripples. She watched Major Danielle Ross blur into nothing. 8 months in Portland. 8 months of being nobody, of being safe, of being forgotten. She'd taken a medical discharge after Ticret, shrapnel in her left shoulder, in her ribs, the kind of wounds that looked worse than they felt because she'd learned not to feel them at all. The army psychiatrist had offered her a choice, medical board or immediate discharge. She'd chosen discharge because she couldn't survive one more day in a uniform, one more mission, one more moment of being the person who solved problems with precision and violence. She'd chosen to disappear. The bus pulled up, hissing as its hydraulics compressed. The doors opened with a pneumatic sigh. An elderly woman exited, balancing a shopping cart. A teenager in a hoodie boarded. The driver looked at Danielle, waiting. She didn't move. The doors hissed closed. The bus pulled away, leaving her standing in the rain with a dying plant and a dead marine's photo and the cracked mug that proved her son still remembered her. The bus's red taillights disappeared around the corner, leaving only the sound of rain on the shelter's metal roof, a rhythm like distant drumming, like the sound of a helicopter rotor slowing down after landing. She stood there for an hour. Maybe 2. Time felt different now. Slower. More like a courtroom than a clock. The rain didn't let up. It just kept falling, patient and relentless, and she just kept standing, letting it soak through her jacket, watching the puddles multiply across the concrete. There were boxes in her apartment still unpacked from 8 months ago. She'd never bothered to unpack them because she'd always known this wasn't permanent. Nothing ever was. She'd move again, somewhere else, another job, another city, another identity. She could disappear again. The skill set was still there: change your name, start over, become someone new. She'd done it before. She could do it again. 2 days passed. Her apartment was dark and cold. The boxes stared at her from the corners. She didn't answer her phone when her son called. She didn't shower. She didn't eat much. The succulent died completely, the leaves turned brown and brittle and finally just fell off when she moved the pot. She didn't throw it away. She just left it sitting on the windowsill like a memorial to something. On the 3rd day, a news alert lit up her phone. Armed man enters Oak Creek Memorial ICU. Law enforcement responding to active threat situation. Danielle read the notification once. Twice. She didn't think about what it meant. She didn't weigh the options or consider the consequences. There was no decision to make because something deeper than decision had already been made months ago, made in Ticret, made in her blood and bones and muscle memory. She grabbed her keys and left the apartment. The drive back to Oak Creek Memorial took 11 minutes. She hit traffic on Martin Luther King Boulevard but drove through it anyway, legal limits forgotten. The rain was heavier now, drumming against the windshield hard enough that even at full speed the wipers barely kept up. The hospital appeared suddenly through the downpour, its emergency entrance ringed with police vehicles, their lights painting the rain in red and blue, the colors running down the wet asphalt like spilled paint. Danielle pulled into the parking garage instead of stopping at the entrance. She got out of her car in the dim concrete darkness, the sound of rain echoing off the ceiling above, and moved toward the service entrance. She still remembered the building. 8 months wasn't long enough to forget. The service door opened with a badge key that she no longer had, but hospital security systems were surprisingly easy if you understood which doors locked and which ones only appeared to lock. She'd learned that skill in 2007. It hadn't gotten any harder. She climbed the stairwell, her footsteps muffled by the sound of sirens and rain outside. 3rd floor. 2nd floor. She reached the ICU level and slowed, listening. Voices above, multiple, tense, male. The negotiation had already started. Police in the hallway, probably. Tactical units positioning. It would take them time to develop a plan, time to negotiate, time to get authorization for entry. Time she didn't have. Because Colonel Rivera was up there, and the man trying to kill him was no longer just a corrupt doctor making convenient mistakes. Danielle pushed open the stairwell door into the ICU hallway. The hallway erupted into chaos the moment she pushed through the stairwell door. Her son was somewhere in this building. No, that wasn't right. Her son was safe. But Colonel Rivera was here, and the man with the gun had his weapon leveled at a cluster of nurses huddled near the medication station, their badges catching the fluorescent light like targets. 20 feet. She measured the distance the way her body had learned to measure distances, not in time, but in velocity and angle and consequence. The gunman's stance was aggressive but untrained, shoulder hunched, grip too tight. His eyes had that wild, unfocused quality of someone running on adrenaline and desperation rather than discipline. He was screaming about lies, about his father's career being destroyed, about people who needed to pay. She moved. Not ran. Moved. The way water moves when the dam breaks, inevitable, direct, utterly without hesitation. Her hands were already reading the geometry of his arm before her conscious mind finished registering the threat. Her body was a weapon she hadn't let herself acknowledge in 3 years, and now it woke up like muscle memory recognizing its own name. One hand redirected the gun barrel upward. The muzzle flashed. The sound was a thunderclap in the enclosed space, the bullet tearing through a ceiling tile, dust raining down like snow. In the same motion, not separate, all one fluid catastrophe, her other hand struck his throat. Not to kill. To disable. The strike landed with the kind of precise brutality that comes from understanding exactly how much force stops a man without leaving him dead. He went down. His knee buckled first. Then his back hit the tile floor with a wet, gasping sound as the air expelled from his lungs. The gun clattered away, spinning across the linoleum like something alive and panicked. Before he could process what had happened, Danielle was on him, her knee pinning his spine while her hands were already working before tubing free from the nearby cart, the plastic line that had been designed to deliver medicine, now repurposed as restraint. "Stay down," she said. Her voice was flat. Absolutely calm. The voice of someone who had given orders in places where disobedience meant caskets. "Don't move. Don't speak. Breathe slow." The man was gasping, trying to form words, his massive college linebacker frame completely neutralized by someone 100 pounds lighter who knew exactly where to apply force. Her knee didn't shift. Her hands didn't shake. Security was already running from the stairwell. She could hear their boots, could hear the radio chatter exploding with codes and responses. But that wasn't the moment everything changed. The moment came when her son stepped into the hallway. He was still in uniform, campaign colors with the dust of deployment still visible on the sleeves. He took in the scene, the gunman zip-tied and immobilized on the floor, his mother kneeling on his spine with the kind of calm that belonged in interrogation rooms and disaster zones, not hospital hallways. His eyes went wide for exactly 1 second. Then his face rearranged itself into something that looked like clarity and pride and the kind of recognition that comes from understanding you've been blind to something your whole life. "That's Major Ross," he said. His voice carried across the hallway like a proclamation. "My mother." The nurses stared. The security officers froze. The words hung in the antiseptic air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Major. Not nurse. Not just a woman who'd been isolated and humiliated and fired. Major. The rank carried weight that credentials and certifications never could. Before anyone could process that, before the whispers could even start, Colonel Rivera was wheeled out from the ICU bay. The wheelchair pushed by a charge nurse whose hands were trembling so badly the chair nearly dropped. Behind him came a man in dress blues, a Navy SEAL team leader with the bearing of someone who'd walked into fire more times than most people had walked into grocery stores. He took in the scene with a quick assessment of someone trained to read tactical situations, and then he did something that would echo through the hospital for months. He saluted her. Not a casual half gesture. A full, sharp salute, fist to chest, arm extended, the formal military recognition of rank and honor. "Major Ross," he said. His voice was steady, carrying the particular cadence of men who'd operated in places where words had to be precise and true. "Silver Star. Silver Star. Purple Heart." Each medal was its own sentence. Each one landed like a hammer on stone. "Your record precedes you. Colonel Rivera specifically requested your son for his task force because of something you wrote to him years ago about leadership under fire. He wanted that caliber serving under him." The silence in the hallway became a physical thing. The nurses looked at each other. They looked at Danielle. They looked at Dr. Ashford, who had just emerged from his office doorway at the sound of the commotion. His face went gray. Not angry gray. Not defensive gray. The gray of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. He'd seen the gun, the violence, the blood on her hands, and now he was watching the careful architecture of lies he'd constructed get dismantled by a single word, Major. A word that meant she'd survived things he couldn't comprehend, trained for scenarios he'd never faced, and had been walking these hospital corridors carrying a rank he'd dismissed without even knowing he was doing it. That's when the IT guy appeared at the detective's shoulder. He was young, maybe 30, with the particular bearing of someone who'd served and come home to civilian life that didn't quite fit right. He'd always nodded respectfully to Danielle in the hallways, and she'd always recognized the look in his eyes. Another ghost trying to learn how to walk among the living. "Detective," the IT guy said quietly. "I'm a veteran. I recognized Major Ross the day she started here." He held out a tablet. "I also recognized what Dr. Ashford was doing." On the screen, 37 separate video files. Time-stamped. Dated. Dr. Ashford entering the supply room at 11:33 p.m. on March 14th. His hands transferring controlled medications into his personal bag at 11:52 p.m. The precision of someone who'd done this dozens of times before. The files continued. Dr. Ashford altering medication orders. Colonel Rivera's name highlighted. The alteration was specific, a dosage change that would cause exactly the kind of lung collapse that nearly killed him. The medication itself was correct. The quantity was lethal. He tried to delete everything an hour ago, the IT guy said. His voice never changed. "I had it backed up in 3 places." The detective's expression hardened like concrete setting. Within minutes, Dr. Ashford was being read his rights in the very hallway where he'd dressed down a nurse in front of patients' families. Where he'd strutted with the confidence of a man who believed the system would always protect him. The handcuffs clicked with a sound like finality. The hospital board met in emergency session that same night. Danielle's termination was reversed with a formal apology written on letterhead that probably cost more than her entire monthly apartment rent. They offered her the ICU supervisor position, the job that would have sold everything if she'd ever actually been given a chance at it. She asked for 24 hours to think about it. That night, she sat with her son in a hotel room near the hospital. He'd been reassigned to a training facility in Oregon, new unit, new posting, a fresh start that Colonel Rivera himself had facilitated. Everything was connected. Everything had been circling back the entire time she was living in the dark, thinking she was invisible. 16 months passed like scenes in a photograph album. Danielle returned to Oak Creek Memorial as ICU supervisor. She rebuilt the culture that had been poisoned by Ashford's corruption. She mentored 3 young veterans through nursing school, people who'd seen what she'd seen and needed someone to show them that you could carry those ghosts and still save lives. The cracked mug her son sent her years ago now sat on her desk, next to a thriving succulent that had somehow survived her rock-bottom moment at the bus stop. The faded unit patch, once hidden inside her jacket lining, now hung framed on her living room wall beside her son's commendation and a photograph of Colonel Rivera shaking her hand at a ceremony where she'd been formally honored. When she visited her son at his new posting outside Portland, they walked through the parking lot together in the clean Oregon light that made everything feel possible. And there, checking IDs at the visitor entrance to the hospital he'd once run, was Dr. Ashford. The plea deal had cost him everything. Medical license revoked. Assets seized for restitution. Employment restrictions that left him with security work, checking badges at a gate where he'd once held absolute power. His uniform was ill-fitting, his bearing diminished, his eyes the color of defeat. He saw her. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second, and he looked away. Danielle didn't break stride. She embraced her son in the sunshine, and in that moment, Colonel Rivera's words came back to her, the words he'd spoken the day he was discharged, steady and certain, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." She never looked back. They drove away together, and in the rearview mirror, Dr. Ashford was just a small figure in an ill-fitting uniform, checking badges at a gate he used to own, a man who'd learned too late that the quietest people in the room are sometimes the most dangerous. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in power who didn't know your true value, like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, would you have walked past him too, or would you have said something? Because that moment, that choice to say nothing, might have been the most powerful thing she did all day.